We're live now.
Woohoo. This is excellent. So I'd like to begin tonight's event by acknowledging that the author and many of the panelists here today live and learn in the Treaty 7 territory of Southern Alberta. These lands have been shared by the Niitsitapi, who are the people of the Blackfoot Confederacy, including Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Stoney Nakoda, including Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations, and the Tsuut'ina First Nation. The area is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, to which I belong. We are here to be in good relations, and I am honored to be your MC for this event. Thank you to Fernwood Publishing for organizing this book launch for the intrepid author Kimberly Williams at the Kickstarter. I came to know Kimberly and her book through a mutual friend, Dr. Aubrey Hansen, a colleague at the University of Calgary. Kimberly was looking to have an Indigenous eye give critical feedback on her discussion of Indigenous people and content principles outlined in Gregory Younging's 2018 Elements of Indigenous Style, a guide for writing by and about Indigenous peoples. As an Indigenous scholar, editor, and fan of critical scholarship, I jumped at the chance to be part of this process. I do not profess to be an expert in all things Indigenous or how to write about Indigenous topics or groups, but I was willing to share what I knew and to learn in the moments where I had questions about her work. What I came to know was that Kimberly is an exceptional feminist scholar with a quick wit and deft ability to call out issues as she sees them. In the examples of misogyny, white supremacy, and settler colonialism, just as her title suggests. In this book, the author tackles so many of the problematic and take-it-for-granted aspects of the Stampede by providing concrete examples from media and pop culture and It really is a wonder that no one has written about this in such depth before, but it took the keen eye and strong scholarship of Kimberly Williams to pull off such a hard-hitting, truth-telling piece of literature on this controversial and often polarizing topic, Stampede. Be able to introduce all the speakers and panelists for today and to invite the conversation that will follow. So we'll begin, of course, by introducing the author, Kimberly Williams. So Kimberly A. Williams, she, her, is an award-winning author, teacher, community activist, and engaging public speaker. She is an associate professor and coordinator of women's and gender studies at Mount Royal University, where she teaches courses on men and masculinities, intersectional feminist, critical race, and queer trans theories, the processes, politics of colonization and decolonization, transnational feminist movements, and global gender issues, including the global sex trade industry and health and care policies and practices. Having earned her PhD in women's studies from the University of Maryland in the traditional territory of the Pamunkey and Piscataway, Kim is a white settler doing her best to live unsettled in Treaty 7 territory on the hereditary homes of the Niitsitapi, the Stoney Nakoda, and the Tsuut'ina nations, as well as the Métis Nation of Alberta. In her time off, Kim hangs out with her best friend, a mini mystery mutt named Cricket, with whom she plays agility, climbs mountains, and explores Calgary's off-leash parks. In addition, I'm also part of the panel, and I am a member of the Métis Nation of Alberta, as I mentioned earlier, as well as a newly appointed assistant professor of education, as well as the Faculty of Social Work at the University of Calgary, with a nomination for Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Child Wellbeing. My research focuses on the holistic well-being of youth and Indigenous education towards systemic change and reconciliatory action. I also am series editor with DIO Press, which features Indigenous scholarship in its many forms. And it is with great pleasure that I introduce James Demers, he, him. He has worked as a LGBTQ diversity educator for 9 years across a variety of sectors and corporate partners in Treaty 7 territory, Mohkinstsis. He is also a trans activist, athlete, bunny dad, which you might have to elaborate on, performer, public speaker, and a drag producer with Fake Mustache Drag. He has committed his life and career to uplifting LGBTQ voices and building bridges of understanding in all aspects of art, life, work, and play in the communities around him. I'm going to introduce Michelle Robinson, who I've come to know in a few circles, and just a real honor to be able to share some of her bio as well. Michelle Robinson is a facilitator for mending broken hearts, healing unresolved grief through the White Bison Wellbriety Training Institute. She is a volunteer on the Calgary Police Service Indigenous Justice Committee, the volunteer Indigenous liaison for 12 Community Safety Initiative that runs the only open to the public Indigenous book club, chapters and chat for over 4 years. She is a co-chair of the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, Girls and Two-Spirit Calgary Committee. She is also assistant producer for Calgary Animated Object Society to encourage youth to go to post-secondary through opening an RESP and encouraging folks with low income to utilize the Canada Learning Bond. She is co-founder of Voices, a group advocating for the Two-Spirit and queer people of color in Calgary. She is the Calgary chair for the Indigenous Peoples Commission of Alberta. The First Nations was the first First Nations to run for City Council of Calgary and ran East in April of 2018. She is co-founder of Sovereign Spirits, an Indigenous, queer, and LGBTQ2IA+. Michelle is a proud mom and now homeschools. She is also she also has the podcast called Native Calgarian, and that's in its 3rd year, and it is a phenomenal program for those that have not heard her program before. So I'm going to now pass the mic to person of honor for tonight's event, Kimberly Williams, and we look forward to hearing from you about your book.
Oh, thank you so much, and thank you all for being here. I'm told that there are 150 people that I can't see, so I'm so honored and excited. And I really am thankful for Michelle and Jennifer and James who are here with me tonight. And Oyinda Ilaka from Fernwood Press has been amazing in this whole process of publishing this book and getting it out into the world. And Shelf Life Books has been really supportive as well. So thank you all so much. So I thought that I would start by just kind of giving you a little sense of where this book came from and how it emerged out of my brain. And I tell the story a little bit in the introduction, but it's funny, and so I thought I would share it with you. So I moved to Calgary in the summer of 2009, and I moved here because I started my job at Mount Royal, and you have to move to Calgary just to teach at Mount Royal. So I did, and my dad helped me drive up. And so I drove I was working at Indiana University in Bloomington, Indiana. So we left from there in my snappy little red Jetta, and we drove thousands of miles, up, and came into Calgary. And I know that it was July 4th of 2009 because it was stamped on my work visa, right, that I had for some years. And so I remember this day in my memory. And we drove into the city, and we drove up the Deerfoot, and then we got on to Glenmore because I live in Glamorgan, so right near Mount Royal. And we started seeing odd things. but both of us were like, well, we're tired and that's whatever. So we go to the house I had rented, and none of my furniture was there yet. We knew it was on a truck, but we didn't know when it was going to get there. So we kind of just camped out for a few days, but we had no like utensils or pots or pans or anything. So we had to eat out. And in the meantime, I have to put my money in a bank and I have to organize myself, right? Okay. So we start kind of just doing those errands, like let's run to the grocery store and let's go and buy some dishes, and we got to go to eat, so we go to the restaurants and we got to go to the bank. And well, every place had like hay bales and like cowboy hats, and people were dressed in some strange Western wear that I did not see when I was here for my job interview the previous March. And my dad, he had driven up with me. I forgot to mention that. So no, I did. So dad is with me, and we're just like, what is happening? And my dad had grown up in a farm in southern Indiana, actually. So he kind of got it a little bit. He understood the horses and he got the hay. But he's like, but he's looking around the city and he's like, this is not that sort of place. Like, what is happening? And so it took us a few days when finally we were at Montana's having dinner, and we asked one of the waiters, like, what is it? Is there some event? Like, what is happening? And she's like, oh yeah, Stampede is happening. And both my dad and I were like, oh, thank God. Because we thought the whole place was like out of their minds, something. We didn't have any idea what was really happening. And so we finally understood, okay, there's this event. And she explained to us what the event was. And she said, oh, you should go check it out. She said, that's why I'm wearing these really short shorts and this cowboy hat. And I said, oh, okay, I understand. Okay, so we got it. Excellent. Good. So like a couple days later, again, still running some errands, getting settled. My dad and I are in the car, and there's a red light. So and I'm driving. So I have to pull up behind this massive truck. And I see that there's a red light in the truck. And so I pull up behind the truck, and I noticed that there are a massive set of purple rubber truck balls like hanging from this truck. And I'm like looking at the light, being like, please light change before dad notices these big rubber truck balls. And I'm just praying and praying and praying that the light changes, because I don't know if dad is going to know what they are, or like how long it's going to take him to figure it out or whatever. And so anyway, so the light is still red, and dad, he like leans forward and he looks and he's like, is that? And then it dawned on him what it actually was. And he looked over at me and he goes, what the fuck? And so that's where the book came from, because I thought, that's a good question, Dad. Let's find out. So that was the book. And so I started, so the next summer I went to the Stampede, and just started looking around and seeing, what is this event? And I talk a little bit in the first chapter about what I saw there and the kinds of things that I started thinking about during my first visit in 2010. And so then the whole book is kind of just based on that one question my dad asked, and then the questions that I had like after going to the Stampede and really being on the grounds, and just kind of sitting with it and thinking through, what's going on here? What's going on with this event? And the answer is not a simple one, as I try to unpack in the book, but you all will let me know. So that's how this all happened. So Jennifer, who's next?
James, we'd love to hear from you next.
There we go. Yes, thank you. My feeling in reading this book is it was such a relief to have someone finally articulate the thing that I felt like I felt like the squeaky wheel for most of my sort of growing up and doing activism in this city, where I was just, I've always hated the Stampede. And because it was, when I was growing up as a young queer activist, it was the week my friends got beat up. It was the week it was dangerous to walk through the middle of the city. And then when I moved into working into nonprofit, it was the week that my staff got harassed downtown every single day. And there would be drunk people on the front steps of my building. And they'd be like, it was really like this constant unsafe experience. And I've grown up in Alberta my whole life and never understood the attachment. And so it's always been this, I've always felt like the squeaky wheel, and it was so nice to see someone articulate the things. It was like, yes, this is awful and unpleasant, and there's another way to talk about a level of like there's another way to celebrate Western culture that's not just straight up misogyny and racism, and I don't understand why we default to that. So it was so nice to see that articulated, because I think there's a lot more to this place than that, frankly. So that was my initial response. It was very cathartic. I felt great about it, even though obviously there's a lot of work to do, but thank you for writing it.
Thank you, James. We can pass the mic to Michelle.
Sure. Wow. I am so happy somebody finally wrote this book. So it's interesting, James, you really set the tone there for what Stampede is actually like for most of us. As an Indigenous woman, it's pretty hard to feel safe in the city under the best of times. And then during Stampede, it's really hard. I know that there's a, group of migrant Mexicans that are sitting in basically a shed right now, waiting for Sneak a Peek to open up tonight, and not getting properly vaccinated, all that fun stuff, because it's 2021 and we still have basically slave trade. As an Indigenous woman, I know how many sex workers come just to do this work for this week. The demand is there. I know a lot of oil companies have places rented out that they own for work that are really just brothels that end up what they end up being. And then I know 8 to 12 weeks from now, the Kensington abortion clinic is going to be jam full. There's going to be more divorces that happen, and there's going to be people in counseling trying to fix their, and the worst part is actually there's a lot of women that look the other way for 2 weeks and they do their own thing for 2 weeks too. So, Calgary is not a nice place for everybody. They say they're a family event and are having Stampede. Well, no one under 12 could get a vaccine. So how family friendly are you really? So, but we know that this event is political. It is the impetus of colonialism. We know that. This is the group of ranchers that got together, the Big Four, to steal this land from the Blackfoot while they could under the Indian Act, and while the Northwest Mounted Police allowed that to happen, and under legislation enforced by the Canadian government. So, Stampede is, a big drunk. It smells like puke and beer for 2 weeks, and the average Calgarian that I know goes away camping and heads out for Stampede because it's disgusting. So we have tourists that come usually from the States and basically wreck our city, and the politicians are happy enough to take their money. So that's what happens. So like for me and my daughter, obviously, she has to be pretty close to me, and if we're going to be on the grounds for whatever event, because it is not safe for a young little girl to be on those grounds in any capacity, just as James articulated how the queer community experiences their bashing this week. This is where the male gaze is articulated against women and socially acceptable. And, the irony being, it's a whole bunch of Christians that say that they're running this event, but they don't act very Christianly for 10 days, that's for certain. So yeah, we need this book. We need to be critical of what we see. We know all the politicians come to do their politicking, especially with elections coming up. So it's always interesting watching the new candidates talk about, what they think Stampede, because if you drag on the Stampede, there's no more powerful entity in this city than the Stampede board. And we all know that. And people have been too afraid to speak out against it. So that's why I applaud Kimberly with her bravery, being courageous and writing this book. I'm super excited to read it. So yeah, thank you for writing it. And I'll just send it back to Jennifer right now, because I just take the mic and keep talking. And I think everyone here knows that. So you better take the mic away.
And I think we'll just keep passing the mic around shortly. But yeah, no, I feel the same way. I was just so grateful to read the book. You know, Kimberly articulated things that I couldn't quite put my finger on, but bothered me. Like there were so many aspects of the Stampede that bothered me to my core, and I didn't have the, you know, the words and the background to articulate them. All those problematic things that just are so evident in the way you write about, have written about Stampede, and you know, just like the things that to have that narrative. You know, I've taken my kids to different field trips, you know, been that parent chaperone, and listened to people say, you know, when the settlers came, this was just untamed land, and there's that narrative of that frontier myth, right, that you describe in the book, and how that's so pervasive and how it's allowed to be. And well, something like Stampede just perpetuates it again and again and allows it to be this Western frontier that was, you know, this Wild West territory that, you know, didn't have inhabitants. And we know that's not true. And of course, you know, there's all these indigenous peoples that have lived here for, you know, hundreds of years and not, you know, been able to maybe speak back, or we haven't been able to speak back to this event that is so damaging and probable. So thank you, Kimberly. I just appreciate it so much that you have written this book. And I'd like to open it up to the panelists for questions for Kimberly, or further comments about what you've read so far or about the event. And if you want to go first, James, or back to you, Michelle, either would be fine.
Yeah, I just unmuted myself as quick as I could because I just, you know, I'm thinking of Jackie Crazy Bull right now, and Jackie Crazy Bull was murdered. There was a group of folks in a vehicle, and they went and stabbed her, and she died right on what is now the Red Mile. It wasn't the Red Mile then, but no, it was the Red Mile then, because that would have been 2007, and we did the cup run in 2005, so it was the Red Mile. And there were other people that were stabbed, but she was the one that was fatally stabbed, and that is still an unsolved case. Conveniently, there's never enough evidence when it comes to Indigenous women, and that's a problem with policing, and that's a whole other chapter in your book, I'm sure. So that's the problem, is that we don't want to be honest about sexual assault. We don't want to be honest about violence, and we're certainly not going to be honest about the ongoing colonialism and genocide Indigenous face, and we don't bring any of that up during the Stampede. One of the problematic things that I've seen time and time again is the objectification of Indigenous women. And this year specifically, there was a white friend who made like tens of thousands of dollars on a painting of an Indigenous woman, and they made her the marshal. And I just can't help but think, like, I don't know how I would feel if a white friend just made a, you know, painting of me and then made a bunch of money. And, you know, there's just something wrong with the way that we've always approached Indigenous art and Indigenous culture and the inclusion of it within the Stampede. And I don't know if I'll ever not see this train wreck. I know that the Stampede, like, there's a talking point they love to give, and it's that, you know, there's back to the settler colonial fantasy that Calgarians have. They're like, well, we didn't like Ottawa, so we had to make sure that Indigenous people would be here. So we fought Indian affairs and we made sure that they would be here. But the truth is that, you know, they only allowed very small movement for us. And the Indian village now has a very small group of teepee holders, and they are as powerful as anybody else in the Stampede board now. So even Indigenous people have been afraid to speak out, and we're the first generation not to go through Indian residential school. The last one closed in 1997. I graduated in 1994, to give you an idea, for a lot of folks who are probably unaware, who may be out watching us. So to give that example, that a lot of our older generation, you know, we're still oppressed under the Indian Act, and that oppression dynamic is not understood. So when the older generation okays things through the Stampede board or through the city of Calgary, it's because we know that there's still that oppression dynamic. And the irony being, even the most progressive politicians still don't seem to understand that. So of course they always get head nods when they're like, yeah, we're just going to put an Indian burial site called Beaufort Towers outside the city of Calgary, and we're going to, you know, parade and objectify a bunch of Indigenous people for you, but we're not going to actually, you know, give them rights or give them their land or anything like that, right? So there's a real dynamic of power, and it goes through the Stampede in a very unspoken way.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you so much for that, Michelle, because one of the things that was super tricky, it's funny that you've mentioned both the Stampede poster and Beaufort Towers, because I talk about both of them in the final chapter of my book. And it was such an interesting kind of journey for me as a white settler to navigate those politics and be respectful and reflexive, right? And so one of the things that I've tried to do to varying degrees of success, I suspect, is to give that acknowledgement that there are some really extraordinarily powerful Indigenous families that go to the Stampede, that benefit from the Stampede, that the Stampede does right by. And then there's a whole bunch of other folks, you know, as James said, like the rest of us who are kind of just trying to get through those 2 weeks and then the aftermath of the chaos because of the misogyny and the homophobia and the trans antagonism and the white supremacy, you know, that all sort of come out of that settler colonial myth that is promulgated at and by the Calgary Stampede with the help of politicians. I mean, I'm so mad. Y'all know I'm an NDP person, and I'm so mad Rachel Notley's trotting her ass around these parts this week. Like, what are they even thinking, you know? But it is what it is. There we go. So such as it is. But yeah, so I do mention both Beaufort Towers and the Stampede poster in the final chapter because they come back as kind of examples of like, I saw the Stampede do some awesome things last year in response to COVID. And I wrote about those. And then I said, but then they did this Stampede poster thing, which felt really, really icky to me. That's a very scholarly word, icky. Yeah. Anyway, so that's what I have to say about that.
You know, it's interesting. When I was reading through, I really liked that you started with your experience of the parade, because that was my first experience in the very early 90s when I was a kid. And it was interesting because I loved, as this will be surprised to no one who knows me, I loved dressing up as a kid, particularly if I could put on a costume that was masculine in any way. So this was a loophole. I've always despised country music, but I was down for the hat. It was one of those things. And I remember being young and being at the parade, but my single most significant memory, and this came back to me while I was reading this section, because I was having this moment where I'm like, I remember being young and being at the parade. I was trying to reach for what was it about it that I liked so much? But my strongest memory of the parade is it's the first time I saw cultural homophobia happen in front of me. There were two women who walked by holding hands, and the entire run-up of like mostly middle-aged white men that had been like camping out overnight in the parking lot to save their spot for the parade, my dad and grandfather among them, just lit up with catcalling and I'd never seen anyone screamed at in public for showing queer affection. And it is my strongest childhood memory of the Stampede parade, because I was probably 6 or 7, but I knew what was going on immediately. I knew exactly what they were upset about. And I, without having a lot of consciousness at the time, knew what that meant. And then watched a parade where every church group in the city was paraded in front of me. And it was this would have been a year before I started conversion therapy. So that was what it brought up for me in this really interesting moment. And so it was this, when you talk about sort of like the hegemonic masculinity and also the sort of like the cultural value, that colonial cultural value that comes with it, it is also this Christian, there's a layer there, right? I mean, my understanding is to this point in the entire history of the Stampede, there's never been a queer entry in that parade, as far as I know. But I am absolutely certain that a number of and I want to say, like, there are great queer affirming churches, and I work with great people who do that work, and they did an enormous amount of work on the conversion therapy debates, and I want to give them their due. However, my experience of that as a young person was not that. There were no rainbow churches in the city that I could tell at the time. And so it was a very different experience. But that was an interesting moment for me because it's not a memory I had thought about. I had kind of I stopped going to the parade. I never really went back as an adult, and I avoided it when I grew up. But I think that's part of why. And so I thought that was an interesting moment to have while I was reading it.
Wow. Thank you for sharing. I mean, geez, you know, that like having not grown up here, yeah, it's just I'm actually so honored to kind of hear your experiences, because they validate what I see, you know, in that, you know, I'm relatively new to Calgary. I mean, I've lived here 12 years, but and it is home, but at the same time, you know, because you don't grow up in a place, you know, there's things that maybe you miss, or there's cultural signals, or there's, you know, these undercurrents or whatever. And so I'm really sort of gratified to kind of hear that experience of yours, because then it's like, oh, it kind of legitimizes some of what I feel when I go to the Stampede parade, or really even I'm on the grounds, you know, and kind of, so one of the things that I don't do in the book that I sort of had a plan to do and then couldn't for all sorts of reasons, because, you know, at some point you have to be done, right, is I really wanted to do some work on sort of that Pride Day, right? That used to be like informal gay day, but now has turned into a formal, like, Stampede sponsored, as the first Saturday of Stampede, right? So it should be this Saturday then. Because this is Stampede Eve, my friends, for those of the 150 of us who don't know that the Stampede starts tomorrow. And so, like, I think that there's so much more work to do on that queer culture piece, and sort of how, kind of almost like in Elbow River Camp, and the way in which the Stampede has historically, like, used, and I do kind of use that in a negative way, used Indigenous people. How is now the Stampede deciding to use queer folks, by finally coming around to doing this official Pride Day, which I think if they're doing it again this year, should be only maybe the third or fourth year that it's official. It's a fairly new event, but at the same time, it's very bro. It's so gay bro. It's so gay white man bro, you know, white cis man bro. And so it's like, where do my people fit in? Where do your people games fit in? Like, where are the people who, like, aren't that kind of convenient gay person, you know, that we all sort of think we know about, right? So thank you so much for sharing, because I'm like a bit, okay, good, I got that right. Good.
I think now might be a good time to talk about the erasure of Two-Spirit in general. You know, so a lot of folks are wondering, hey, what's Two-Spirit? And Two-Spirit is a English term for pan-indigeneity. You know, there's over 630 nations in Canada alone. And each nation had their own teachings on somebody whom you would probably perceive as gay or lesbian or transgender. But in our world, in our languages, we had different terminology for that, and we had different roles for that person. And the thing with colonialism is it brought the straight agenda and imposed this binary onto our people. So not only are we erased from the concept of Stampede, but that bigger picture too, that we've never celebrated Two-Spirit as Stampede. And hearing everybody talk about Elbow River Camp, that's a brand new terminology, because we've just called it Indian Village up to now. And I think, me and Jen could probably say Indian, the way a Black person would say the N-word. And I would never say the N-word, and I encourage nobody to say Indian unless you're saying Indian Act, which is embedded in the Constitution, which is still in effect today. So I just wanted to bring that up because, the colonialism, Christianity, and that imposed religion onto our people has really hurt our Two-Spirit population the most. And they are the most underrepresented voice, even in the inquiry. It wasn't, we still don't have the numbers because so many Indigenous folks are ashamed to be Indigenous. They're ashamed of colonialism. They're ashamed of authority. And so when their, lesbian daughter is murdered, they're ashamed to call her a lesbian two-spirit, or whatever cultural term that they used to have, because of so much, internalized shame, internalized hate, internalized racism, internalized homophobia. And we're not honoring those who are two-spirit in our country the way they should be honored. And a lot of the different nations had a very revered position for two-spirit. So imagine these, uptight conservative Christians coming to Canada and seeing, the most Ken Monkman, Joshua Whitehead, outgoing, flamboyant native being like, who the hell do you think you are? Coming to my land, coming to my country, talking to my women this way. And of course, that's exactly who the Christians targeted the most and hurt the most. So, it's really important to bring that up, because I don't know if Stampede knows how to not use the term Indian, let alone Indigenous, let alone two-spirit. And yeah, it's back to the whole purpose of having voices or sovereign spirits was that even in Calgary, the white, queer society really excludes a lot of people of color. So if you're Black, if you're Asian, if you're Indigenous, you don't have a place there. And it's so highlighted in the 4 gay events that they've had in Stampede, and that's so-called progressive. And we're just not seeing that real inclusion yet. It's not just baby steps like this. It's the uncomfortable conversation no Stampede board wants to have, and we need to have these conversations, and we need to really you can't say you're a family-friendly place. It is not safe for young kids. It's not safe for anybody who's not old and Christian and rich. It's just not. And you better have hundreds of dollars to spend on drinks and Stampede games and everything. It's ridiculous. It's just a money hoarding place, and which is great for revenue, which is part of the reason why I think it's going this year. It probably, at the very least, they could have postponed it until August, until everybody had their second vaccine. But no. We have migrant workers. We got our paperwork for. We got, all of the rodeo folks that are staying in Strathmore to go through their 2-week quarantine. So we're pretty dead set. We're doing it this day, and money matters, and especially when politicians are involved. So.
Yeah, I mean, so much of what. I'm sorry, James. Go ahead.
Oh no. If you want to add to that, I won't interrupt you. I was just gonna say this. We have to get away as a community from this idea that assimilation is progress. It's absolutely not, right? And that's my issue with the pinkwashing of Pride Day. Is I have had the opportunity to train the Cowboys staff when they had a drag brunch in 2019. They made the point of training 700 servers. It was 25 minutes, but that was a miracle in and of itself. But they did it. They did an LGBT 101. They made and the handoff. And I will give Cowboys props. They're not open for Stampede. They refuse to. They made the choice, and I think that's really interesting. But the difference is that drag makes money, and Stampede wants money. And so they're willing to tolerate queerness in an assimilated gender binary fashion, as long as there's no men kissing on the midway, and it's contained within Cowboys preferably. And do you know what I mean? Those queens who are being flown in by the organization probably couldn't walk through the midway. Absolutely not. And in modern day, and that's not reasonable. So there's this idea that without Stampede making significant systemic intersectional cultural change to their event, that queer people are ever going to be actually welcome is just not true, right? That's not realistic. So that's the thing, is you can make Stampede look safe to get money from people if you'd like to. Queer people have entered unsafe spaces to get what we wanted out of art for our entire existence, right? We exist in a world that's unsafe for us. Fundamentally, it's just more unsafe during Stampede, but that doesn't make going to Stampede progress. I don't think it's progress. And I don't want to deride people who are I want to, go and do the thing. As queer people, we should get to make a choice about how we live our lives, right? That's what we're fighting, the right to choose. And that includes going to Stampede, and that's fine. However, we could also, there's accountability there, right? If we're in that space, it's our job to make sure that it's less racist, or preferably not racist. And so there's we can't accept this weird assimilation on one side without bringing others with us, and it's just not possible to do that with Stampede.
I mean, I totally agree. And one of the things that I tried to do, because I didn't in my first book, and I got slammed for it by some people, and so I thought, oh no, I have to do it in this book, is provide like next steps, right? Like what happens now? Like I've just spent 5 chapters, telling all the problems. So now surely there's got to be something afterwards, right? And the Stampede's not going anywhere anytime soon. So what are some alternatives? What what could work, right? And I do enumerate some things in the final pages of the book. But one of the things that strikes me, and I say this quite clearly, is I kind of actually even have a little sentence in there, which is, dear Stampede board, call me. I know people. Because look at you. I mean, look at you all. And if they could just have a conversation with any one of you for like a half an hour, and then call all your friends, and then, and my friends, I mean, they actually could change. There could be possibilities, right? But until it's like, I don't know, it's like unless you admit you have a problem, there's like no hope. And they refuse. They just keep like putting band-aids on shit. Every 5 seconds they're like, oh, we realize that we haven't had a woman on the board in 18 million years, so let's find some white women. And it's like, that doesn't quite, Michelle's laughing at me, that doesn't quite get the job done. Like,
I'm laughing because what a historic day it is that we have yet another male in charge of the women's ministry and culture here in Alberta. Like, well, congratulations, Kenny. Congratulations. I'm so happy you got another white, straight, cis Christian to be in charge of, culture and women in Alberta, and especially at Stampede. I mean, I feel so represented as an Indigenous woman in the middle of a genocide against missing and murdered Indigenous women, child welfare apprehension. I just can't think of a better day to celebrate having a Christian white male cis man in charge of my portfolio yet again.
Everybody who follows me on Facebook, of the 150 people out there, y'all know I'm super mad at the UCP. Like, I can't even, like, it's things like that. It's just like the status of, what do they even call it, multicultural, and the status of women. I don't even know what that portfolio is right now, but they changed it from the NDP. I don't even know.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, here's the thing. I have spent part of this pandemic delighted watching ranchers scream at the UCP. That's lovely for me. I have agreed with more country music stars in the last 18 months of my adult life than in my entire adult life combined. And we have more in common in this very strange way. And I just hope it makes an impact, because I do love this place. Like, this is the thing that's so frustrating for me about Stampede, is I do love this city and the people in it, and the tenacity that comes out of people here. And that Calgary is a space, and this place in and of itself, we've always done things differently for lots of different reasons, right? There's just no reason that we can't do this better, so much better. Frankly, the money's there. So that's often right? Like, think about the money that could go into the arts and culture section if Stampede was a funder rather than an event. Think about what the artists in this city could create that would be worth celebrating in this city that wasn't this. I don't know. I've never been that passionate about a Bud Light. I just don't see the point. Like, why can't we do something more interesting with the incredible art scene that is here that gets buried by cow paintings? Do we need another cow painting? No. No one needs another cow painting. So I'm just like, it smothers the arts and culture scene, which is spectacular and has the potential to support hundreds of thousands of jobs here that were really talented people. So that's the other thing, is Stampede's this huge funding drain out of sponsorship and corporate sponsorship capacity. It prevents corporate partners from investing in things like anti-racism, right? This weird sort of holding this kind of hegemony together. It's a big part of it. So, and because it's hard for a sponsor to go to a queer organization who also sponsors Stampede and answer that question, as it should be. But imagine what kind of resourcing we could create for the city if Stampede was actually willing to invest in the rest of the city, right? And I don't know why they don't pay taxes on that land, but that's a whole other conversation about their nonprofit status that I have lots of feelings about.
No, the answer to that question. Because the Stampede is not its own self. It's a subsidiary of the city. which starts to explain some of the incestuous relationships between particular politicians in the Stampede board. So the Stampede is a subsidiary of the city. It does have its own nonprofit status, but basically the city of Calgary owns Stampede Park. And so the Stampede pays rent to the city of Calgary, or lease essentially. And I have the figures in my book, but it's so I'm not off the top of my head, but it's a very, very, you know, minimal amount, like less than $20 a year for however many decades, right? And the lease was just renewed a few years ago. So that's why they don't pay property taxes, James, is that they don't own that. They don't own Stampede Park. The city does. So I do, basically. We all own Stampede Park.
Well, then we have a good argument to make.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Yeah. One of the things I was going to say before is something that, no, sorry, Jen. Something that comes up a lot in my classes is, you know, students will ask me like, okay, so I'm on board with this feminism thing. I get it. I'm totally on board. You know, after a few weeks, they'll come to this, right? But then they want to know, but how come some people who call themselves feminists don't pay attention to Indigenous issues? And how come some people who call themselves feminists are what I like to call feminism appropriating radical transphobes, or farts, right? Some people might know them as TERFs, but I call them farts. So how can we have these conversations together? And for me, I really did try to demonstrate how we can do that in this book. That like feminist scholarship has to, it's not feminist otherwise, in my opinion, has to be anti-capitalist, has to be decolonial, has to be in support of people of all genders. Because when you start to hear what like James is talking about, what Michelle's talking about, what Jen is talking about, they're all connected. They're all part of, or all consequences of white supremacist capitalist heteropatriarchy, which is Bell Hook's term, you know, from the mid 1990s, right? So that we're still having these conversations where some people are like, oh, I'm a feminism, but I don't like trans people, feminist, but I don't like trans people, or how can I be a feminist, but some feminists don't support Indigenous people. Like, I don't even understand those conversations because they don't make sense to me. Like, literally in my head, they're all connected. And so I just wanted to say that because something Michelle said a bit earlier kind of like triggered that for me. And I often feel like feminism gets like such a bad rap, like there's such stigma against it for similar and different reasons as stigma is applied to other kind of social justice movements. But that's kind of the sort of feminism I was trying to mobilize in this book. So really thinking about, you know, how to do an intersectional feminism that is decolonial, that is anti-capitalist, that is embracing all genders and advocating for social justice for all these people, because it's all connected. So thanks, Michelle, for, you know, putting that in my head.
Yeah, well, it's important to talk about. Like, I think one of the like secrets that nobody talks about is that we have an international two-spirit that came out of Southern Alberta, and her name is Katie Lang. And she's an original BB, you know, she's part Blackfoot, and nobody wants to talk about that. And, you know, they literally shunned her off of the consort sign by saying she was a vegetarian. Like, they tolerated her being a lesbian, but the day she said she was a vegetarian, you know, that conversation was not going to happen. And it's interesting because a lot of animal rights activists will every year protest the Stampede. And for some reason, it just always goes through. And actually, I have found that a lot of, you know, extreme animal rights activists are exactly racist to Indigenous people and don't understand our inherent rights and don't understand assimilation and colonialism. So it's so hard because I would love to get together with all of these groups, but they still don't see how we are interconnected and how they may have privilege, but they're so focused on just the animal rights. And you know, and rightfully so. I mean, I remember the one Stampede, and this is a really awful story, so folks who are really upset, about animal issues, you may not want to listen to this one, but they had this really great idea that we're going to go for a long ride with the horses, and they're going to go across the bridge and cross the bow. And they didn't think to turn off the C train. And when the C train went by, all the horses got spooked and jumped off the bridge. And they had to like put like 7 horses or something down. And there was like a kid that was there watch the whole thing. Like it was awful. Like all the kids watched this like train wreck happen. And that's beyond the chuck wagon races and the amount of horses and animals that are killed every year because of Stampede. And, the rodeo, we still do. And we have rodeos that, like, that's just the Stampede is the kickoff actually for all the rodeos across Alberta. Like Panoka has a big one, Strathmore has one. Like there's all of this, just as there's the powwow circuit, there's a rodeo circuit, right? And it's the same folks trying to make all the money as they go through that whole thing. So, I'd love to have that intersectionality with a lot of different activist groups, but sometimes we just get so focused. And, I guess maybe I'm the pot calling the kettle black there too, because, and when I hear LGBTQ and I don't hear the two, I'm just like, all right, let's talk about your erasure of colonialism or erasure of Indigenous and colonialism. And let's talk about that. And again, how many gay men, like I had the awful messages and like public shaming by gay men saying, how dare you talk about missing and murdered Indigenous people in the middle of our Pride event? And it's like, you do not see how you are exactly directly related to erasing Indigenous people and our Two-Spirit population in your own damn club. So, anyway, Jen, I want to pass it over to you because you've been so quiet, and I want to bring you in.
No, it's just a phenomenal conversation. So I'm just enjoying all the things that people are talking about. So, and learning so much. Like just as I learned so much in reading the book, I'm learning so much listening to all of you. And I think this is a conversation that needs to be happening. It needs to carry on past this event, and the book is definitely a catalyst for it. But I think, finding that community where all these, voices that talking about this long past today is much needed for Calgary and the Stampede and, really the whole province, the whole country. So, I'm grateful. But I think something that stood out to me, having read through the 94 calls to action with a friend of mine, Jennifer McDonald, we've read through the 94 calls to action, and we're looking for the individual, and of course one of the needing to have greater knowledge and training for people working in the broadcasting, and I think that section, like where you analyze the parade, Kimberly, is one that was just such a profound example of why that all is there in the 94 calls to action, like the importance of people in media being able to name, Indigenous leaders within a territory that they're speaking about, like how important that is, and by not doing it, what it gives everyone else permission who's viewing that program, viewing that parade from the comfort of their home, to not know either, and to not care, and to not have any sort of investment in the groups in that territory. And so just thank you so much for your diligence in writing that section. Like you wrote it from so many different angles about the order of the events, order of the people coming down the road, and like what each of that, the power that's signified in that ordering, but also just to analyze that commentary from Ron McLean and Jan Arden, and just sort of the ignorance that was shown in their broadcasting of the event on that year that you've for the centennial. So thank you so much for bringing that attention to that, to the need for greater education for so many people, and people from across Canada that become part of the event and need to know more. So thank you.
Yeah. Oh, I'm so pleased that that
More.
section worked. Like, yeah. uh, So that chapter is focused on the Stampede Parade, and because and in the centennial, which was 2012, and I really wanted to focus on the centennial specifically because centennial events are these momentous events. I mean, they're celebrating 100 years, right? And there's lots of scholarship on the importance of centennial events for marking for marking particular occasions in more celebratory ways than would normally be done. And so that centennial parade was really the Stampede's 100th year kind of coming out party. No pun intended in terms of some of the queer stuff we're talking about, but like, so what story do they want us to know? And us is really white settlers, right? So what story do they want us to know, and how are they telling it? And so I do in that chapter kind of unpack the order of the parade entries. I do a bit of a quantitative analysis of how many men, how many women, how many people of color, where are the indigenous people, right? Those kinds of things. But then that second part of the chapter is, as Jen is mentioning, also an analysis of the commentary from the broadcast, the CBC broadcast of the parade that year. And I kind of didn't intend to do that. It just sort of like evolved quite organically from the work that I was doing. But I thought, oh no, I was there. I saw the parade in person that year. And so that was really meant to be my focus. But then I was like, well, wait a minute, the CBC broadcast this thing, and that is one of the 94 calls. And so like, what can is there something that I might be able to say about what the broadcasters were showing, right? And of course, one of the things that happens in kind of feminist cultural studies scholarship, particularly media studies, is thinking about like frames of literally what does the viewer see on the television screen or on the computer screen, right? Or on the film screen, what is seen, and so what was seen, and then what was being talked about sometimes don't match up in really quite unfortunate ways, right? And so I talk a bit about the racism of the two announcers, and just the erasure and the just complete lack of knowledge about where they are and who was in front of them and what was going on. Yeah, it was an interesting broadcast to listen to, especially having been there, and to think about the live Stampede Parade versus the CBC version that gets shown to all of Canada. I mean, that's a Saturday morning or Friday morning thing throughout the country. So, yeah. Should we open it up to questions or comments? I'm not sure if that should happen now or not. Michelle, what did you want to say?
I haven't read the book, so I can't wait to read that analysis. We just did the media calls to action, and well, what a bloody great point of view. It's hard because I've tried to tell people how insulting it is to turn on the CBC, even the CBC radio in the mornings, like the way they'll talk about, like, they cannot say Bagani. Why can't they say it? Oh, Began Trail. You can't even do the stupid like road conditions without insulting us, and it's constant, and they don't even see it, like they don't know. And that's so TRC 57 is all public servants should have anti-racism training and Indigenous education. And every time I turn on the radio or watch the CBC, I can just like say, oh, that was racist, that was racist, that was racist. But I mean, everybody knows I'll just say it, and then it just gets ignored, like the Beaufort Tower issue. For those who don't know what I'm talking about, there's a piece of art that's on the west side of the city that came in, and it's literally the white artist grew up seeing Indian burial sites and had made a whole entire career replicating and culturally appropriating them. And the city of Calgary was like, yeehaw, let's put that in. And they spent $1 million putting in an Indian burial site, which all natives know what that is. And, they got the okay from the same elders that give the okay for everything because of oppression dynamics nobody wants to acknowledge. And, you pay somebody who's, marginalized and in poverty, and you give them money and say, hey, what do you think of this? It'd be like, yep, it's great every time. I promise you, if you paid me to give you the green light, I'd do it. but obviously I'm not a part of a nonprofit, so I don't have to constantly say yes sir, yes sir, yes sir, like a slave would, like the way you treat a lot of our Indigenous liaisons in your nonprofits. Anyway, not trying to get off topic too much. Back to that idea of the art, public art, like James was talking about how much money doesn't go into it, because like white males are all like, why are we investing in art? We don't want these damn women having damn ideas, and these gays, they get so much already. They don't want, what are we funding them for? And these damn Indians, all they want is our money. All they do is take. And then they perpetuate these stereotypes constantly. So the whole narrative of how culturally inappropriate the Beaufort Towers was completely sidewashed, because the louder voices got all the attention from a racist media that doesn't know how to properly investigate this, by underfunded Indigenous sources. So like, of course I had to start a podcast, because at a certain point it's like, when are we going to have a voice ever? There's nobody properly critiquing this, because our jobs are dependent on us going, yes master, you take my land, master. I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to placate you anymore, right? And we need to call out this racism. We need to start bringing in the diverse voices, the diverse people. Imagine how much more fun Stampede could be to have Katie Lang as a regular person that's like a spokesperson, rather than having a Coca-Cola stage. You imagine if we actually honored Katie Lang properly, maybe some of the other amazing people in our lives that are here that we could, properly honor through the Stampede, that we don't, because, it's by white, male, cis, straight Christian men that they just marginalize anybody else at that table. And we know, like for folks who don't know, like we're talking multi-million-dollar industry. That's why all the politicians come here and kiss their babies and make sure that they would rather die of COVID than not have the Stampede. They'd rather your babies die of COVID than not have the Stampede, because that's a multi-million-dollar loss they don't want to do. Like capitalism. Back to Kim's point about how, feminist has to be intersectional. I mean, we're exploiting migrants, we're exploiting sex workers, we're exploiting. We have to change the system.
And just by way of sort of saying the last thing, I suspect, before Jen sends us off to answer questions and hear comments from everybody, is the very fact that that I really did mean for this book to be a beginning. I followed some breadcrumbs that were left for me, and then I left some breadcrumbs for people who will come after me to finish this work. So Michelle's been mentioning the Mexican migrants that are being kind of quarantined essentially so that they can work at the Stampede when it starts, I guess officially tomorrow, but there's a sneak peek tonight. And so I didn't talk at all about the ways in which immigrants and racialized folks that aren't Indigenous were depicted in the Stampede Parade in 2012. And in fact, there's one thing that I remember having to cut from that chapter, because my editor was like, it's too long, Kim, you got to figure something out. But there was a section of the CBC broadcast where one of the, not main broadcasters, so not Ron McLean or Jan Arden, but like one of the folks, the local CBC folks that was like out on the street kind of doing like, let's interview the crowd kind of thing. I won't say his name, but that particular segment was really cringeworthy when it came to racism against Latinx folks. And I wasn't able to write about that because it's just, not everything can fit in. So it's like, there's so much more room, right? And so I really want folks, like literally when you open this book, you will see what I mean by it. Follow the truck nuts, follow them. They're there for a reason. Like they really are there to say, look, this piece I couldn't get to, or this piece might look different if someone asks different questions about it, or use a different research method, or, those kinds of things, because I'm only me, and I approach things in certain ways and I ask certain questions in certain ways, but like other folks might do things differently. And so there's lots of room for folks to like take up little bits of things. So follow the truck nuts, follow them.
I had to laugh because you were calling them breadcrumbs. I'm like, those are not breadcrumbs. They're definitely truck nuts. So follow the truck nuts is right. Oh, Yinda, is there a way for us to get questions from the viewers and the audience?
Maybe while they're doing that, we can chit chat a little more. And when will we see those questions, do you think? There's nothing worse than dead air. But back to Jan Arden. Holy, like she's one of like Calgary's biggest celebrities, man. And yeah, I've seen like anti-seal stuff come from her as well. Like she doesn't know, and like folks like Rick Mercer love her so much, so they elevate her more than I can possibly imagine. And I mean, I want to celebrate a woman from Calgary that's doing well, no question, but not at the expense of others, right? I don't know if I've ever heard anything homophobic come from her, but I know I've heard racist things or anti-Indigenous bias. Nobody likes being called racist, right? But it's like, well, okay, well then let's make it a little easier for you to digest with some anti-Indigenous bias, right? Um, and yeah, I wish I would see that less from the folks who advocate for animal cruelty. They say such awful things about us as Indigenous people. And the irony is we have ceremony to respect all of the animals and the ones that sacrifice themselves to us for us to eat. We utilize all of that, right? Like everything. Like even our original canoes had like, skins to it or pieces. It's incredible when I think of people accusing us of misusing animals, when I see the mass marketing of like beef and chicken. Oh, we didn't even talk about the turkey.
Yeah, and I thank you for pointing that out, Michelle. I had a at a time in my life was definitely involved in a lot more animal activism in that place, and there really is a divide between this like white savior feeling that comes with so much of that activism that completely disregards decolonization or the knowledge of traditional Indigenous peoples and their relationship with the land. And you can see that in the way it's advertised frequently. I mean, and Pete is a great example across the sort of globe for having that kind of a problematic language, but it does prevent us from being able to talk about these issues. So I remember having that feeling at I went to a sort of a conference built around these ideas, and it was remarkably homogenous and very uncomfortable for that reason. I'm just like, I think you might be wrong. I think you might have other problems here, But it is something like if we can bridge those conversations, that's so vitally important. Like I often think as a queer person, if we had not experienced first contact and residential schools and the genocide of millions of Indigenous people here, my life as a queer person in terms of what the world could have grown up to be could have been so much easier. Like my own sense of learning to honor myself could have gone through a very different experience. Like we have so much to learn as queer people from a decolonized globe where we have always been valid in those places and we deserve to be, but we're not there, right? Because of this story, because of this pervasive and overlaid story. And I find that really, really difficult, but it's worth remembering that there would be no queer rights movement without the civil rights movement and the feminist movement. Nothing in our own activism would exist without the allyship from those folks. And so we have so much to learn. I think it would be really powerful to take an Indigenous perspective on a variety of our systems and really think about, like, is this serving people? Because we know it's capitalism, but it's worth asking the question, is this serving people? Because so often it's not.
No, I think about the environmental movement in general. We have inherent rights and we are the stewards of the land. We have been for thousands of years. And it's just a real shame that even like the green movement in general still tries to take away the Indigenous rights component of it. And the irony is, if you legitimately wanted to have, climate change, then imagine if you could just give Indigenous back their land and give them ownership to it. I make a lot of settlers uncomfortable with the idea of, look, for 150 years you've been in charge of this land and look what's happened. What if you gave us charge of it for 150 years. And why does that make everybody so uncomfortable with the idea of us being the landowner, right? And we need to start focusing in that way. Yeah. Jennifer, did you get an opportunity to get those questions?
I have the questions. So
Sweet.
I have an update on that situation. Yes. So Jennifer, I guess I'll moderate the questions. So I love this. So the dream is still dead. Would like to know if I could talk about the persistence of the cowboy icon to represent Alberta, even though mining was a bigger settler industry. And the cowboy obviously does different work as a symbol. I love this question. Yeah, so I will kind of tackle this a little bit, even though I write better than I talk. So read the book. But essentially, one of the things that I noticed when I first moved to Alberta was this, that the economy is male dominated. So you've got mining, you've got ranching, you've got oil and gas, and logging. Yeah, those are the four kind of major industries in Alberta, and they're all overwhelmingly male dominated. And so why the cowboy, right? And I talk a little bit in the book about the connection between ranching and the Stampede, and how that relationship evolved. And particularly in southern Alberta, because that ranching moment, and it really just was a moment, that ranching moment kind of lasted for longer than coal mining did. That's kind of how that happened. And then just thinking in terms of evolution and decades and such, and those folks who like aren't in Calgary or maybe don't know Calgary's history, Calgary's a really new city. Like the settlers showed up here in like the late 1860s, the RCMP, which was then the Northwest Mounted Police, and then the train. I mean, this is not an old city. It's really not even 150 years old. And so so when I'm talking about sort of the evolution of things, we're talking decades, not centuries. And so what kind of ended up happening was the rhetoric of Alberta, right? This kind of, I mean, Aretha Van Herk calls it this maverick identity, right? So you've got these sort of entrepreneurs, these white settler guys who are coming to like tame the frontier and to get everybody in order. And the reason the Northwest Mounted Police were sent out here in the first place was to prevent the Americans from coming over the border and claiming what is now Western Canada. And in the process, right, it was like, well, if we're going to be here, we might as well tame the whole situation and get all these indigenous folks under control, and stop the whiskey trade. So the Northwest Mounted Police had a very particular purpose, and they were all white settler men, mostly second sons from Toronto and Montreal and Ottawa, right, who couldn't inherit land on their own and couldn't inherit their own family's wealth. So send them off and go west, young man. And so there's this maverick spirit here that kind of has been part of the provincial identity for a long time. And the Stampede really uses that to sell itself, to market itself, and to attract its donors and its personnel and all its folks and its fans and all that stuff. And because oil and gas has now superseded logging to a degree, definitely mining and definitely ranching, oil and gas has then taken on this like cowboy mystique, right? We're not going to tame the land because that's been done, but we're going to go for what's under it. And think of all the amazing references. Like you're taking massive equipment that is phallic and drilling a massive hole in the ground. This is, and they use this this rhetoric in really intentional ways to connect themselves to the ranching culture that the Stampede promulgates. And there's actually a little bit of a section that perhaps will help to answer this question a little bit. And so I'll just read a little bit from the end of chapter 5. And this little section that I'm going to read excerpts from is called Misogyny plus Racism equals Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls. And I did intentionally leave out Two-Spirit because I don't I don't know how to do that right now. So that's another truck nuts that we can explore. So I'll just read. Well, I've been finishing up this final analytical chapter for eyes other than my own. So this would have been, I was writing this in July last year. 3 related events have taken place right here in Alberta that can get us started connecting the dots between the Stampede, missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and the white supremacist misogyny of our province's male-dominated oil-soaked economy, the major corporate players of which all bankroll the Stampede and its Indigenous programming at Elba River Camp. So the first of these events was the revelation on social media in February of 2020 that Edmonton-based oil company Excite Energy Services was responsible for the creation and circulation of a sticker, and some of you will remember this, featuring a black and white drawing of the back of a nude woman with the word Greta tattooed across her lower back. In this image, which I actually don't reproduce in the book because it's just redefining all sorts of violence, but in this image, Greta's braided pigtails are being grabbed from behind by 2 large, disembodied white hands. And judging by a Twitter thread that was started by Indigenous feminist lawyer Naomi Sayers, I wasn't the only one to notice that if you remove the word Greta from the image on the sticker circulated by this oil and gas extraction company, it could easily be interpreted as the rape, the forced sodomization of an Indigenous woman or girl. Perhaps even the First Nations princess herself, whom I've always known to wear her hair in braids in the decade I've been working on this book. And for those not familiar with the Stampede, the First Nations princess is kind of the most visible representation of indigeneity of the Treaty 7 nations at the Stampede. And yes, she did used to be called the Indian princess. Even University of Windsor law professor Beverly Jacobs, who used to head the Native Women's Association of Canada, weighed in, and she supported Sayers, whose followers all tended to agree that the sticker was solid proof of toxic masculinity and rape culture that the National Inquiry in 2019 reports is well alive in the oil and gas industry here in Alberta. That was the first event. The second thing that happened when I was writing this chapter was not even 24 hours after the Greta sticker appeared, a decal created and sold by a local Red Deer man surfaced on social media. And this decal depicted a train engine emblazoned with the phrase Alberta Strong, mowing down protesters. And this second decal appears to have been presumably a white settler man's nod, cis man's nod, to the Indigenous-led rail blockades that had ramped up at sites across Canada in the preceding couple of weeks before this decal came out. And the whole thing was in support of Wet'suwet'en First Nations opposition to the planned route of Coastal GasLink's pipeline through its ancestral unceded territory in northern British Columbia. And then the third event that happened when I was writing this chapter was the March 5th announcement by the government of Alberta that it had finally formed a new working group to provide action and direction and input, importing them into the Alberta government's proposed action plan to address the calls for justice contained in the final report of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. And their goal, they said some things about building in Alberta where Indigenous women and girls are valued, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And while announcing the new working group, Indigenous Relations Minister Rick Wilson, he's a UCP MLA, made clear that based on the National Inquiry's findings the previous year, that resource extraction projects often exacerbate men's violence against Indigenous women, he wanted the new working group to begin by taking a look at Alberta's oil and gas sector. So let's recap. The government of Alberta knows, thanks to the National Inquiry, that the infrastructure and systems of its resource extraction industry, which is collectively trying to harness and profit from the 3rd largest oil and gas reserves in the world, are harmful to Indigenous women and girls living in the province. To find out how, because apparently they're so confused, they've set up a working group that will make some recommendations, although as of this writing and as of right now, the timing on that remains unclear. Additionally, white settler men in our province think it's far 2020 to create decals depicting the violent assault of climate change activists, many of whom are Indigenous and or women. In fact, two of the most famous climate change activists in the world right now are teenagers, Tui Toomburi and Anishinaabe Kwe water protector Autumn Peltier, both of whom wear their hair in braided pigtails. And so I talk a little bit about the sort of performance of this type of masculinity, which combines climate denial, racism, and misogyny. And the success of the oil and gas extraction industry here in our province very much depends on the underpaid labor of all women, by the way, too, right? And that's something we actually haven't talked about in this conversation tonight. And research has shown that anecdotally, overwhelmingly, there's male dominance at all levels of the oil industry. And that's resulted in the normalization of sexual harassment and rape culture that's endured by women living in and near the oil fields. And then I talk a little bit about how that culture, though, doesn't stay up north, right, where the oil fields are. These guys go home to wherever they go, Newfoundland, or maybe Edmonton, or Calgary, or wherever they go. And there's a lot of kind of research that's been done about the fact that they bring then those like misogynistic attitudes, racist attitudes with them back to where they end up. And so Calgary's oil and gas companies support the Stampede, particularly its rodeo events and Elbow River Camp, because doing so generates positive brand associations through a performed commitment to community. And this is a huge critique I make in my book, and it's a question that I keep coming back to, which is, who's greatest together? The Stampede Parade in 2012 said we're greatest together. Well, who's we, right? And the who's we is what I try to answer. But these are the same corporations whose pipelines are being pushed through unceded lands without consent, and whose employees have produced with impunity the racist, misogynistic decals I just talked about. So the toxic masculinity of the oil and gas industry has become the hegemonic masculinity of Alberta, which is embodied in the Stampede's Petro Cowboy. So those truck mats my dad and I saw when I first moved to Calgary back in 2009, they're not just funny. They are funny, right? But they're not just funny, and they're not just cliches. They're settler colonial pedagogy that make very clear what can happen if I and Michelle and James and Jennifer and a whole bunch of others in our city don't conform, don't comply. And in the whole conversation around those decals and those three events that I just mentioned, Deb Tomlinson, who is, I want to get this right, she's the head of the Association of Alberta Sexual Assault Services. She was interviewed, and the news media covered some of this and wrote about the interview with her. And she said, "This is who we are, Alberta." And so my question is, what are we going to do about it? To use the words of Aritha Van Herk, someone's got to be accountable. And that's really what this book is about. And so hopefully that kind of answers the question about the connection to the cowboy and the oil and gas industry and the Stampede. Let's see what's next. There might be more. Oh gosh, let's see. Oh, interesting. So one person, they say, "I'm unsure about the author's upbringing." Oh, do I have some stories? But it would be nice to hear more about the contrast between coming from the US to Canadian cowboy culture, or if there's anything similar to Stampede in the States. That's just a lovely question. And I will answer it very shortly by saying I'm from the US East Coast, just south of Boston, born and raised in urban areas, went to school in Washington, DC. I have no idea, like truthfully, that to me what was so shocking is I had lived in Canada before. I had lived in Toronto. And one of the questions that I got asked quite a lot when I first moved here was it culture shock? And I was like, no, not because I moved to Canada, but because I moved to Alberta. Like that for me was a culture shock. I think it would have been equally a culture shock if I had like moved to Wyoming. You know, this is just not my, it's not my milieu at all, nor is it Calgary's. And that's actually my point in the book a little bit, is that it has nothing to do with this city at all. This cowboy stuff, like it just is not historically accurate. It's not representative of what most of us are doing here, honestly. Okay. Yes. This is such a good question. One of my biggest frustrations
while you're looking.
Jennifer, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. No, I don't want to cut you off. I just thought that while you were looking for your next question, that maybe June could talk about how to, but just in case there are people that do need to leave at 8 o'clock, I know how to buy your book. But then I'd love for you to answer the question you have ready to go. So June, are you there to talk about?
I am, yes, hi. I just wanted to say, first off, like, I'm Jun. Hi, I'm one of the events coordinators here at Shelf Life Books. I wanted to thank Kimberly, Jennifer, Michelle, and James. Thank you for this like wonderful, like very thought-provoking conversation tonight, and for, I guess, this intellectual and moral support for the next few days ahead, starting tomorrow. Us Shelf Life Books is right smack in the middle of it here, so we get to see all the vomit. We get to, you know, escort our coworkers, especially our female coworkers, home after the shifts at night in groups. You know, it's Stampede, guys, Stampede time. Woo! Anyways, and Kimberly, thank you so much for writing this book. It's very timely, and you know what? It's about time that somebody wrote this book. That being said, you can we do have copies here in the store. There should be a link there in the chat where you can buy your copy online, or you can pick it up at any of your favorite independent bookstores. You know what? If you buy from an independent bookstore, you're supporting independent book selling, you're supporting independent publishing, and you're supporting the author here, Kimberly. So yeah, that's all I have to say. Thanks again, and you can continue with your question.
Thank you, June, so much. Yeah, I should mention too at this point, I forgot to say, and even though Yinda doesn't know this, nor does June, but I'm so excited that, so I'll say, for those of you who are watching that might not know, like I'm a professor, and so I don't get like directly paid to write this stuff. It's just part of my job. And usually, you know, books, sometimes they make enough money to get have an author get royalties, and sometimes they don't. This one may or may not, I don't know. The publisher always has to pay off their own expenses first, right? And then maybe you get some royalties afterwards. But if I get royalties, which I don't know if I will, but I'm mentioning this because I'm so honored that Awatan will get all the money that I might make if I get royalties. I don't need them. I mean, I have a very good job. I'm fine. So I'm going to just send them all the royalties. So there's incentive to go buy the book. You know, Awatan Healing Lodge is this amazing organization in our city that focuses on like indigenous approaches to healing and recovery from family violence, and they just do amazing work, and they don't, like all nonprofits, get any of the recognition or sort of resources they deserve, and so in any case, that's my little effort to kind of support their work. So do we have time for one more question? And I can't tell what time it is if I have my phone on right this way. So this is a really awesome question. I love it. One of my biggest frustrations is when white authors benefit and profit off writing books / literature about racism, white supremacy. And the person who wrote this cited a particular author whose name is Robin DiAngelo, who wrote a book called White Fragility. And so the question is, what are my thoughts on writing literature tackling white supremacy and racism while also recognizing your responsibility to communities most impacted? I love this question. So as a white settler, and so I kind of, there's an analogy in my head to men who ask, well, what can I do about violence against women? Well, who better to solve the problem than the people who perpetrate it, right? And so I am very much an insider to white supremacist culture as a white settler. I know all about how it works, and I benefit from it. And so who better to write about white supremacy than a white settler, right? But I got it wrong sometimes, for sure, you know, and like I walk into 19 walls a day and fall down and get a bloody nose and try to listen to the people around me and get back up again and try tomorrow, you know, and in between there, I might cry. You know, I have a very excellent therapist who I hope is here tonight. I've invited her, you know, and so this is why I talk to her once a month, right? So it's a super tricky topic, and that's also part of why I asked Jennifer to look at the book before anybody saw it, really, because I wanted to just have a second set of eyes, a more skilled set of eyes on some of the arguments I was making, some of the language I was using, to make sure I was getting it right, or at least close to right as was possible. And I have a whole, I try to be really transparent throughout the text about some questions that I just couldn't answer. I want some, there's, I think, some truck nuts. There's a bunch of truck nuts in my chapter on Elbow River Camp and the First Nations princess, because I want somebody who knows something more than I do to ask some more questions about those things. I know that there's lots I don't know, and that's kind of what I was saying earlier, that like someone who approaches things in a different research method than I do, right? So I don't interview people, but if someone did interview people, that would make such a cool book, or, you know, like really. So, so yeah, that's kind of how I tried to navigate that and negotiate it. And the other piece of it is that in my teaching, you know, I come across a lot, you know, my job is literally to teach intersectional theory to unwitting 19-year-olds. That's literally my job. And so one of the things that I really try to do is take to heart the reading that I ask them to do, and to model that work in the world. And again, sometimes I do it right, and sometimes I completely fuck it up, but I do the best I can. And so, and it's really important that as a white settler who is a queer feminist, who has been doing social justice work for as long as I can remember, that I keep doing it, even though I fall on my face like 18 times a day, you know, and that's the only way to learn, really. And so if I didn't model that for my students, what kind of feminist teacher would I be, really, in the end, is kind of my thought on it. So I hope that answers the question. And I don't know if any of y'all want to like also maybe chime in on an answer to that question, because I think you probably have some really interesting perspectives.
Yeah, I think I can't wait for an Indigenous person to feel strong enough to really weigh in on that, because you know, I've watched there's for those who are not from Calgary, we have a queen. We have like two white princesses, and the queen is white, and then we have our First Nation princess that's been called the Indian princess until recently, and she is always excluded from all of the other three events that the other three do. So there literally is like a total separation even there. And, you know, when you're around the, you know, settler princesses and queen, they're always uncomfortable around natives. Like the anti-Indigenous bias is so painful to watch. And it's so painful to see the settlers so welcome the, you know, queen and the white princesses, but not the Indigenous woman. And like it's painful to watch. Anyone who has eyes can see it, whether it's like on a TV show, whether it's on an interview, or whether it's like in person. You see it. It's so gross. It's like painful. And I've always felt that I'd love to see somebody interview all the previous First Nation princesses, because, you know, a lot of them are like my mom is so staunch for the Catholic Church, because it was like she was raised in it. And I think for a lot of Indigenous princesses, because they were given an opportunity, they would never say anything negative about the entire process. But like, I mean, if you can see how Jan Arden is on one of the CBC things, like you can easily go through the entire CBC stuff and see how, you know, painfully obvious it is how the First Nation princess is treated compared to the others. And, you know, I wanted to go back to that idea though of concept of cowboys and Calgary's oil and gas industry, because I was in it. I'm second generation oil and gas industry. And I can't tell you how weird it has been. In about the 2000s, I've seen a shift in downtown Calgary. It was totally socially acceptable for us all to wear jeans to school or to work every single day, like totally acceptable. And I think with the new immigrants that are coming in, and the, you know, really the encouragement of assimilation, there's a whole conversation I remember having at the Center of Newcomers where, you know, folks on Casual Friday would be allowed to wear jeans at work. But for cultural people who come to Calgary, that is not normal for them. So they literally had to go buy jeans to do so-called Casual Friday that was totally outside their norm anyway. And so there's a really weird culture here when it comes to, if you're white, wearing jeans is totally acceptable, but as soon as you're not white, now we suddenly have to have a dress code and business attire. And that has changed so dramatically, I would say, since about 2000, maybe 2005-ish. Just being born and raised here and seeing that. So, and I make fun of everyone with native Calgarian, because if you say to me you're a native Calgarian, I say, what nation are you from? To really start to question your, concept of land acknowledgement. Because if you call yourself a native Calgarian, I know you don't know how to say Bagani. I know you don't.
Yeah, no, I agree with all those pieces. I just don't think this city needs to be defined this way. And I think that it holds us back. I think it holds the West back, if I'm being completely honest, in having conversations about green energy, in having conversations about supporting arts and culture in an appropriate way, in talking about moving into the 20th century with our policies and the way that we create our communities and all of these things. Because often in the context of intersectionality, right, if you look at the people that are the most affected by the worst parts of this event, if we could improve the lives of those people, if we really looked at let's improve the lives of those people right now, we would all benefit from that. And I don't know what we're so afraid of. The short answer is there's some white men that would lose their jobs because they wouldn't be valuable anymore. Maybe that's fine. Maybe that's necessary. Maybe the representative tables of power in the city need to look different. And maybe there needs to be, I'll call it a separation of church and state between oil and gas and the people that manage the people in this province. I don't think there should be an oil and gas rep anywhere near our healthcare, our education, anything, nothing, absolutely not. And there's so much to value in this place that is not this narrative that we keep being told. And I don't know, there's a fear of breaking away from that narrative. And that's because I like to say that's because 5 people in a certain level of power want it to be that way. And if we wanted to change that, there are more of us. We could change that, right? And I want to acknowledge that there's this argument that comes up with Stampede where it's like, well, what about Mardi Gras? And what about Festival? And what about, right? There's these like this sort of this blowing off steam, this like festival culture. And I'm like, okay, that's great. That doesn't mean it can't evolve, right? Comic-Con is a really interesting example of talking about consent culture. There's absolutely no reason that Stampede couldn't be a champion for women and girls. That's not a totally absurd idea at all. They would just have to want to do it. So I think this is the thing, is like change is not only possible, but it's easy. It would take just simply the political will and the valuing of individuals to really show the world what this city is and what it presents and what it can offer. But we're not, and so being smothered by Stampede is helping none of us. But what if we could turn that resource into something that was actually about this city and the people in the city and our actual history? Like that would be groundbreaking, right? What if we changed the story of this place and centered Indigenous voices in order to tell the story of this place? I feel like it's a benefit to all of us, and it would be true. And I don't know if you've ever had the opportunity to look into Indigenous storytelling, like there are so many heroes there that we've missed, that we deserve to celebrate, that could tell us a totally new story about this place that would be so much more valuable and centered around people. So we don't have to be afraid of letting go of this narrative. The rest of the world is. If we don't catch up, we're going to miss that opportunity, and that will do all of us a disservice. So I'm hopeful to see the change, but it can't come from the people in positions of power now.
I mean, James, it's like you're like this with me right now. I mean, that, it would be so easy. One of the things that I write about a little bit in the conclusion about like some ideas that I have for how the Stampede might be able to shift itself. And I make this exact point, like it is not hard. It's super not hard. Like, yes, if they really wanted to like seriously overhaul, yes, that's hard work, that's difficult. But like to have the Stampede support women and girls and have a rhetoric around please don't assault them while they walk home at night, like that's not hard. It's not hard to do, right? So and I even actually talk a little bit in the last chapter about some ideas I have about making Stampede Park like gender inclusive. That also would not be hard at all, right? It just wouldn't be hard, nor would it be expensive. So, and the thing is the Stampede has such influence and such power. I've literally in the last like 12 months just been watching them deal with COVID in horror, just because all it would take is for the board chair, the board president, to get on a microphone and say, people, we love you. We support you. We are part of your community. We understand that there's a global health pandemic. We're not sorry we have to cancel the 2020 Stampede. We're in fact very in support of having to cancel because there's a problem. And also we're going to cancel 2021 because there's still a problem. Like, it would take no effort, and they know the power and influence that they have. And it would turn around all these anti-maskers. It would turn around all these, like, I don't, like, all the folks who are like, there's no pandemic, there's no pandemic, there's no pandemic. I mean, they would just shift the rhetoric if the Stampede and all its power and influence would make those kinds of statements and really get behind the community it purports to support, right? Which actually brings me, interestingly enough, to this last question. I want to acknowledge that the person who sent me this question, I think that I know via email and also through her work. Her name is Kimberly Skye Richards. And so, hello, she's in the audience. She wrote this phenomenal article that I found just as I was finishing up my work, my research, and like kind of getting ready to send it off to my editor at Fernwood. But just kind of doing a final check to make sure, do I have everything? Do I have everything I need to really do this work properly? And she wrote this amazing article that showed up in the Drama Review in 2020 and or 2019, I can't remember, but quite recently. And Kim Richards was a Stampede Queen contestant, and she's now a performance studies scholar, a feminist performance studies scholar, doing this amazing work on Alberta's oil and gas industry and some of the ways in which it performs. She can talk about her work better than I can, but in the way in which it performs a particular kind of masculinity and a particular kind of climate change denial as part of its everyday practice. And she has a whole article on the Stampede and the oil and gas industry's kind of performance of the Stampede, performance at the Stampede. And it was her work that got me really to be able to articulate, like, oh my gosh, she's totally right. These 5 oil and gas companies own Elbow River Camp. Like, that's no joke, 5 of them. And so she wants to know, why do I think the Stampede has been overlooked so much by academics, except for she and I? And I should also give some props to a couple of folks in the 80s who did some work, and also Max Foran, who used to be a historian at the University of Calgary, and he has a whole edited collection, did a lot of work on the Stampede in the mid 2000s. Yeah, I don't know. I kind of feel like I want to throw it back to her in a way. I think I kind of feel like it's such a powerful organization, and I kind of wrote this, like, it takes somebody either really stupid or really brave. And I think I might be both. And it's only time will tell which one is going to come out on top, I think. And I also think that, you know, the kind of work that I do and the kind of work that Kimberly Richards does as well is very cultural studies oriented. And so that's why I think having someone who does ethnography, having someone who does surveys and can stand outside Stampede Park and have people who are leaving or going in, you know, answer particular kinds of questions about their experience at Stampede could be so cool. And I just don't do that kind of research. And so that's why I'm like, who's gonna take it up? Like, follow the truck nuts, you know? Because I think that there does need to be more work here, and, you know, journalists and academics and Indigenous folks that, I mean, Michelle, you should write that book about where you interview all the former Indian princesses and First Nations princesses. I would read that book.
You know, I have to say, though, I remember when my friend Naomi Sayers came to Calgary, another feminist had brought her in, and we were in the UFC at the Husky Room having this conversation, and I wish people knew how insidious it is to see the oil and gas industry constantly funding everything. I mean, even Pride, like, you open up Pride and all it says is like, it's sponsored by, you know, the pink washing is disgusting. And it's across all of Calgary. And in fact, it's encouraged, right? And when it comes to actual Indigenous healing, trauma healing, the Christian organizations will not fund Indigenous culture. And they still perpetuate Christianity through their AAs and all these awful organizations that like make you pray before you can, and pray to the white Christian God. So like it's so gross. And like even my husband's old company, I mean, just to give you an idea, like he was employed in, he was headhunted in oil and gas prior to the pandemic. And the company would have, you know, prayers, was it Thursday at noon or something. And anyone who wasn't there, we all knew were going to be on the chopping block. And of course, my husband was on the chopping block because he wasn't a Christian. But when Rachel Notley was in power, when Justin Trudeau would come to Calgary, they literally had the signs in the office, and everybody was told, you know, here's your sign, go down and protest Rachel Notley and Justin Trudeau. And that is Calgary culture, and that is funded from oil and gas. And it's the same oil, like the people who are the executives in oil and gas are the ones who are sitting on those boards, and they're all incestuously connected, I tell you, all of them. And so, you know, folks who were not born in that wealthy privilege of stolen land, stolen resources, and capitalism, they of course will never be at that table. And when they are, they're silenced, right? The oppression dynamics so painful. And if you as a politician have the audacity to be critique at all, you know, conservatism, Christianity, or the Stampede, you're not winning a damn election, let me tell you, as somebody who's ran twice. So
Yeah,
very true.
I like to think about it as Stampede for me has always been what I consider the death knell of the patriarchy. It's like one of the last places where this is allowed to exist. And it seems like as the world evolves rapidly around this culture, it feels like Alberta has always been stubborn. Sometimes that's good and sometimes it's not. But it's always, I mean, I started doing queer activism under Klein. I have lots of feelings about it. But so, you know, so like it's this, there's this stubbornness, and I feel like the grip, like this is, and I discovered this when I was working with the gay rodeo circuit, actually, which is interesting because rodeos have been banned in Europe for decades. When they brought the Royals to the Stampede, is like, what are you doing? They banned those 30 years ago in the UK because they're ridiculous cultural insensitivity. But yeah, so there's this thing though where I think there is this layer of the world, and we've seen a resurgence, unfortunately, because of Cheeto over the last several years. We've seen this resurgence of this toxic masculinity that must be adhered to. I saw a post the other day. There was this really amazing Black activist in the States who said the reality is most men up until this generation women haven't had to like them for them to have access to women, right? This is like the chances that your fathers and grandfathers, and moving further and further back when women had less rights and couldn't have bank accounts, all these things, right? That like they probably weren't very good people because we didn't have a culture which ensured that we were respecting each other in that way. And like we are asking for people to change, frankly. And I do think that we are fundamentally responsible to leave the world a more ethical place than we found it, and includes evolving our celebrations, whatever they happen to be, right? Pride has to evolve. Stampede has to evolve. And so this is the thing, is like those celebrations should look different for different generations, I would hope, right? Because otherwise we end up on the wrong side of history and we stifle the opportunities to really show what we can do. And so I think that what's interesting about it is that why don't we want to evolve the Stampede? Why don't we want to celebrate what exists here? And I think it is because there's a handful of people who don't want to change. This is their last bastion to behave however they want, and they will ride it screaming to the ground, which is fine because at least they're heading to the ground. Because you know, time is long. But there's so much potential here, and so many people that deserve to be given a voice in how we represent our city that aren't.
My friends, I'm mindful of time, and we were to end at 8, and so I haven't heard from Oyinda at Fernwood that we should end, but I feel like we probably should end. Is there any other last things that anybody has questions about, or Oyinda says we should end. Yes, LOL, she says. So Jennifer, I'm going to hand it back over to you, but I'm just first going to say thank you all again so much, and this is going to be an interesting and fun journey. So you know where to find me. I'm super easy to find at Mount Royal University, and so please don't hesitate if you want to be in touch or you want to fetch about the Stampede or complain about the book or anything at all, you know, please, I'm super, super easy to find. So, so I look forward to like continuing this conversation. So Jennifer, over to you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you to Oyinda and to Jun and to James and Michelle, and especially to Kimberly for writing this amazing book and creating the space for the conversation that needs to happen so that the change can happen and the world can be better. So thank you so much, Kimberly, and thank you to all the people that came today. I hope you do pick up this book and read it and share it with everyone you love and care about, because it's a conversation that needs to happen, especially in Alberta, especially now, for the sake of everyone and for the earth too. So you address just everything that is so problematic, and I'm grateful to you for writing it, and you're not stupid, you're brave, and that's evident in everything you've written. So thank you, Kimberly, for including me. To everyone that came here today, and safe travels to powwow, all the people that are heading to powwow this weekend, or not powwow, sorry, Sundance. It's heading into Sundance. It's new moon and we're heading into Sundance. So safe travels, and yes, thank you again, Kimberly.